In 1899, a city stood 18 kilometres northeast of Kalgoorlie with more than 12,500 people, 16 hotels, its own breweries, its own churches, its own hospital, and its own newspapers. Today, stand on the ground where it stood and you will find a railway platform, 2 cemeteries, and a scatter of holes in the red earth. Not a ruin, not a ghost town of leaning facades and broken windows, the kind of thing tourists drive out to photograph. Almost nothing at all. The hotels are gone, the churches are gone. The newspapers printed their last editions and vanished along with the presses that made them. 12,500 people once lived on this ground. This is what is left of them. This is Kanowna. In 1892, the colony of Western Australia was on paper a poor one. A scatter of sheep runs and small ports, its population under 60,000, its treasury thin. That year, gold in payable quantity turned up far to the east at a place that would take the name Kalgoorlie, out past the last reliable water and the last settlement that could honestly be called a town. The following year, in 1893, a richer field was found further into the same country, at a place soon renamed Kalgoorlie. Between them, the two discoveries did what payable gold has always done to men with little to lose. They moved population by the thousands into country that had, until then, supported almost no one at all. This was the eastern goldfields, red earth, mulga scrub, and spinifex, flat to the horizon in every direction. A country where rainfall could be counted in a season rather than a month, and where summer heat could not be borne without shade and without water. Water was, in the plainest sense, the one thing the country did not have. What existed lay in soaks and rock holes known chiefly to the Wangutha people, whose country this was, and to almost no one else. A man who went looking for gold in the eastern goldfields went looking in country that could kill him for want of a drink long before it made him rich. And in 1892 and 1893, thousands went anyway. It was in this country in 1893, the same year as the Kalgoorlie find, that gold turned up again, some 18 kilometres northeast of it. On a stretch of ground the first prospectors called White Feather. What they found there was not reef gold, locked in quartz and requiring stampers and capital to crush it free. It was alluvial gold, loose, shallow, carried and weathered out of its parent rock over some immense span of time and left lying in the wash and the gravel, where a man with a pick, a shovel, and a dish could go and take it with his own 2 hands. Alluvial gold asks nothing of machinery and nothing of investors. It asks only for someone willing to dig, and on the Western Australian goldfields in 1893 there was no shortage of those. By 1894 the diggings had a new name, Kanowna, and the colonial government, moving with a speed not otherwise typical of it, gazetted the town site that same year. A name on a survey map is not a town. It is, however, the beginning of one, and the speed of the gazettal tells its own story. The rush to Kanowna was not a rumour drifting slowly from camp to camp across the goldfields. It was immediate, and it was large, and within a year of the first find, the government already knew it would need streets laid out, land set aside, and a name to put on railway timetables that did not yet exist. They came on foot. They came leading camels loaded with water bags and canvas. They came later by whatever coach or dray could be hired at Kalgoorlie for the 18-kilometre run. They came for the same reason men had come to Kalgoorlie and to Kalgoorlie before it: gold lying in the ground at a depth a shovel could reach, and a report, passed dray to dray, camp to camp, that the country northeast of Kalgoorlie was rich, shallow, and for the moment still unclaimed. Most of them came without any clear idea of what they would find when they arrived. They came anyway, because the alternative was to stay where they were and watch other men get there first. And then, very quietly, in the space of a single dry year, a stretch of red earth with no permanent water and no history of settlement beyond the soaks of the Wangutha, became a diggings with a government surveyor's peg in it, a gazetted name, and a growing population of men with picks and dishes. Nothing about the country itself had changed. The mulga still stood where it had always stood. The rock holes still held what little they had ever held. The heat still did what it had always done to men unused to it. What had changed lay underneath, a finite quantity of gold, laid down by water long before anyone came looking for it, now being read out of the ground one dish at a time by men who had no particular reason yet to ask how long it would last. By 1897, 3 years after the Gazettal, Kanowna held something over 2,500 people, already a considerable settlement by the standards of a colony still getting used to owning any goldfields at all. That was not the summit. 2 years later, by 1899, the population had risen past 12,500, and the town that stood on ground, which had carried no fixed population whatsoever before 1893, was by then one of the largest towns anywhere on the Western Australian goldfields. 5 times the population in 2 years is not the arithmetic of a camp filling in slowly around a lucky claim. It is the arithmetic of a rush still running at full speed, 6 years after it began, with no sign yet of slowing. A town of 12,500 people needs somewhere to drink, and Kanowna obliged. At its height, it counted around 16 hotels, among them Donnellan's Hotel and the Criterion, standing on streets that had been bare scrub within living memory of the men drinking in them. It needs beer to fill those hotels, and breweries went up to brew it on the spot rather than freight it in over roads that barely deserved the name. It needs somewhere to bury its dead and somewhere to pray for the living, and churches went up for that. It needs a hospital, because a goldfields town without reliable water. In summer heat, with men working underground and men fighting and men simply worn down by the country, generates casualties on a schedule of its own, and a hospital went up to meet it. It needs to know what is happening to it. And newspapers went up to tell it, recording marriages, deaths, claims, and prices in a town that had not existed 6 years before. None of this arrived by accident, and none of it arrived slowly. A railway was built out to Kanowna, tying the town into the network that connected the goldfields to Kalgoorlie, and through Kalgoorlie to Perth and the world beyond it. Building materials came in on that line, brewing equipment came in on it, printing presses came in on it, hospital supplies and 16 hotels worth of stock came in on it, people came in on it, in their thousands, and gold, presumably, went out. What paid for all of this? The hotels, the churches, the hospital, the newspapers, the railway spur, the sheer physical fact of a town where 6 years before there had been mulga, red dirt, and rock holes known only to the Wangutha, was the alluvial gold, shallow, plentiful, and, for the moment, still being found in quantities that made the investment look sound. Nobody laying bricks for a hospital in Kanowna in 1898 was pricing in the geology of the ground beneath their feet. They were pricing in what the last dish had turned up, and the dish before that, and the one before that again. Stand in Kanowna in 1899, and the case for permanence would have seemed, if anything, understated. 12,500 people is not a camp. 16 hotels is not a camp. A hospital, a railway, and newspapers printing what amounted to a daily record of the town's affairs are the furnishings of a place that expects to be standing in 20 years, in 50, in 100. Kanowna had every visible sign of a future. It had brick and stone going up where there had been tents 4 years before. By every measure a contemporary could have applied to it, the town had arrived. What it did not have, though nobody standing in the street outside Donnellan's Hotel in 1899 had any particular reason to dwell on it, was a second source of gold once the first one ran out. The reef gold at Kalgoorlie, 18 kilometres away, went down into the rock rather than lying scattered across the surface of it. A different kind of deposit entirely, worked a different way, with a different kind of future attached to it. In 1899, Kanowna was the larger town. Nothing in the arithmetic of that year suggested that would not always be so. In 1898, word reached a local Catholic priest, Father D.P. Long, that an extraordinary nugget had been found somewhere in the vicinity of the town. A single mass of gold, said to weigh in the order of 45 kilograms, a figure that would have placed it among the largest such finds in the colony's short history. Father Long was told, further, that the nugget's location and the manner of its unveiling would shortly be made known to the public. He believed it. Within hours, so did a great many other people. By the time the announcement was due, a crowd variously put it up to 7,000 men had gathered outside Donnellan's hotel. Among them, a substantial contingent who had abandoned whatever they were doing in Kalgoorlie and covered the 18 kilometres between the two towns at speed, on foot, on horseback, by whatever conveyance could be found, on the strength of a rumour about a rock. 7,000 men do not gather for nothing. They gather because every one of them has done the arithmetic on 45 kilograms of gold and found the answer worth running 18 kilometres for. They stood in the heat outside the hotel for however long the wait demanded, packed shoulder to shoulder on a street that 6 years earlier had been mulga scrub, and they waited on the word of a priest. That, more than the size of the crowd, is the detail worth sitting with. Not the word of a mining warden, not the word of an assayer with scales and acid to test the claim. The word of a Catholic priest passed hand to hand and mouth to mouth through a town that wanted, very badly, for the story to be true. There was no nugget. What there was, when the moment of revelation arrived, was a heavy, roughly semicircular lump of scrap iron, painted to resemble gold by two local men who had judged, correctly as it turned out, that Kanowna in 1898 was a town willing to believe almost anything it was told about the ground beneath it. It was not gold. It did not, examined closely and in good light, even pass for a convincing forgery. It was paint on iron, and it did not survive contact with anyone who troubled to look twice. Because a priest had been the one drawn into vouching for it, the episode acquired almost at once its own name, the Sacred Nugget. Not a fraud, though it was certainly that. Not a joke gone further than intended, though it was very likely that as well. The Sacred Nugget, a title that has outlasted the hotel it happened outside of, the priest who was duped by it, and very nearly the town itself. Set the spectacle down beside everything else known about Kanowna in this period, and a pattern becomes difficult to avoid. This was a town built, in 6 years, out of nothing but the promise of gold still to be found. A town whose hotels and churches and printing presses were all, in the end, wages on the next dish, the next reef, the next report carried in from past the last soak. 7,000 men did not gather outside Donnellan's hotel because they were unusually credulous. They gathered because the entire economy around them ran on precisely the kind of story they had just been told. That somewhere nearby, at that very moment, an enormous quantity of gold was waiting to be shown to the public. It had happened before, at smaller scale, more or less every week. This time it happened at the scale of 7,000 men and a painted lump of iron. The crowd dispersed. Donnellan's hotel kept serving. The two men responsible for the paint and the iron went unnamed and, so far as the record shows, unpunished, absorbed back into a town too busy chasing the next real find to spend long on the last false one. Kanowna in 1898 could afford to laugh off the Sacred Nugget because the actual gold, the alluvial gold, still coming out of the ground in quantities that had built 16 hotels, a hospital, and a railway, had not yet given the town any reason to ask what would happen on the day it stopped. Alluvial gold is not a promise, it is a residue. It sits in the loose ground near the surface, in gravel, in wash, in the beds of ancient watercourses long since gone dry, because water carried it there over some immense stretch of geological time and dropped it when the current slowed. It requires no shaft, no crushing battery, no engine. A man with a pick, a dish, and a cradle can win it in an afternoon. That is what made Kanowna possible in 1893. Gold that lay close enough to the surface for 12,000 people to reach it with hand tools and no capital at all. It is also what made Kanowna's ending arithmetic, rather than misfortune. Alluvial ground has a flaw. Dig down through the wash, and eventually there is bedrock, and bedrock does not negotiate. Whatever gold the water left on top of it is the whole of what there is. Not a reserve, not a seam that runs on into the dark, but a fixed and finite deposit, already largely counted by the pick that turned it over. Once the shallow ground is worked, sifted, and worked again, the easy gold is not diminished. It is gone. Some of Kanowna's miners followed the outcropping vein down into the rock itself, chasing the reef underground the way Kalgoorlie's miners were chasing theirs. But the deep ground at Kanowna did not repay the effort the way the surface had. Yields fell, shaft by shaft and year by year. Not a single collapse, but a steady attrition, each foot of depth returning less than the one above it. A field that had made its name in cradles and dishes was never built, in its deeper ground, to sustain the machinery, the capital, and the years that a lasting reef demands. And beneath all of it sat the water problem, which no ledger of ounces ever solved. The eastern goldfields had almost none of it. No rivers to speak of, no reliable soak. Nothing but what could be condensed, carted, or dug from a soak at ruinous cost. Alluvial washing itself needed water it rarely had in useful quantity. Deep mining needed water for boilers, and batteries it had even less of. A pipeline from the coast, near Perth, would eventually reach the fields, opening in 1903, but it was built toward Kalgoorlie and Boulder, toward the deposit judged worth the expense of bringing water 350 miles across a desert. Kanowna's alluvial ground was not that deposit. None of this required a verdict to be announced. It was already written in the rock before the first pick struck it, and nothing that happened in 1893 or 1898 or the Sacred Nugget could alter it. A shallow field yields what is shallow. A finite deposit, however rich, is spent by the act of being taken. The reef at Kalgoorlie went down into the earth in a body that could be measured in decades. The wash at Kanowna sat in a skin over the rock, measured from the outset in seasons. The town did not know this yet, in any way that changed its behavior. The hotels kept their licenses, the newspapers kept setting type, the railway kept its timetable. But the ground beneath Kanowna held a fixed quantity of future, and every dish of wash that came up empty, every deep shaft that yielded less than the one before it, was the same fact restated in a different register. The gold that had built the town was not a fund that renewed itself. It was a deposit already, in large part, spent. What remained was a hole in the ground, bedrock at the bottom of it, and above the bedrock, less each year than there had been the year before. 18 kilometers away, the same rush that had built Kanowna was building something else entirely. At Kalgoorlie, and at its twin township of Boulder, the gold did not lie in a skin of surface wash. It went down, into quartz, into a reef system later named the Golden Mile, a body of ore that continued at depth rather than thinning into bedrock after a season's digging. It could not be won with a dish and a cradle. It required shafts sunk in stages, batteries to crush the stone, capital to pay for both, and men willing to work underground on wages rather than diggers working a claim for themselves. It was slower gold and costlier gold, and in every way that mattered to a town's future, it was gold with more of itself left to give. That difference did not announce itself in 1893, when both fields were new and undifferentiated, and it barely announced itself in 1899, when Kanowna was still, by any measure of population, the larger of the two towns. Nothing in that year's arithmetic suggested which field would still be paying wages in 1920 and which would not. The distinction was not visible on the surface. It was written in the rock, in the shape and depth of the ore body, and it would only become visible in the ledgers, in what came out of the deep shafts at Kalgoorlie, year after year, without falling off against what came out of Kanowna's shallow ground, year after year, falling. As that difference asserted itself, it moved people, not in a single migration, not on any one date that a newspaper could report as an event, but in the accumulation of a great many individual and unremarkable decisions. A digger whose claim no longer paid moving on to wages at a battery in Boulder, a storekeeper following the customers who had already gone, a hotelier reading the same falling returns everyone else could read, and selling or simply closing before the falling went further. Capital drifted the same 18 kilometers for the same reason. Money follows yield, and yield was now reliably higher and more reliably continuing on the Golden Mile than on the alluvial ground at Kanowna. There was no contest fought and lost, no single verdict handed down in 1 year that could be marked as the turn. Kanowna did not lose a battle with Kalgoorlie. It lost a competition it had never known it was entered in, for a resource it did not have enough of, against a field that had more of the same resource, and would go on having more of it for decades after Kanowna's had run out. The 18 kilometres between the two towns did not shrink. What changed was which side of that distance the gold, the capital, and eventually the people were moving toward. By the first years of the new century, the pattern was no longer ambiguous. Kalgoorlie and Boulder were building for permanence. The water pipeline from the coast aimed squarely at their batteries and their boilers, not at Kanowna's. Kanowna, meanwhile, was still Kanowna. The hotels, the churches, the newspaper, the railway timetable, all still standing, all still functioning, all resting on a deposit that grew shallower every year it was worked. Nothing had yet been dismantled. But the direction of travel, of miners, of money, of the future itself, had already been set 18 kilometres to the west, in ground that would keep paying long after Kanowna's had nothing left to give. A town does not empty all at once. It empties the way it filled, one arrival, one departure at a time, until the sum of them changes what the place is. Through the first decade of the new century, Kanowna's population did not collapse so much as recede, year on year, a tide going out rather than a wave breaking. The alluvial diggers who had worked the shallow ground went first, because their gold was the first to give out, and their claims required no capital to abandon. A man with a pick and a dish could leave as easily as he had arrived, and a great many did, toward Kalgoorlie, toward Boulder, toward whatever field was still paying. Behind them went the trades that had existed to serve them. A store with no customers does not stay open out of loyalty to the town, neither does a hotel, and Kanowna had built 16 of them. They closed in no particular order, and for no single reason beyond the same reason, repeated 16 times. Fewer diggers, less gold, thinner trade. Some licenses lapsed quietly. Some premises stood empty for a season before anyone made a decision about them at all. The churches that had been built for a population of 12,000 went on holding services for a population that was something less than that, and then something less again. The hospital, the newspapers, the school, each institution had been sized for a town at its peak, and each now stood oversized for the town it was becoming, a set of buildings built to a scale that its own population had already fallen out of. Then the town began to move. On the goldfields, a building was never simply a building. It was timber and corrugated iron, bolted and nailed rather than mortared, and both timber and iron were scarce and valuable in a country with little of either growing or buried nearby. A structure that had cost real money to freight in did not stop being valuable because the town around it was failing. It simply became more valuable somewhere else. So the dismantling began. Roofs lifted off in sheets, walls unbolted and stacked, whole hotels and stores reduced, plank by plank, to a pile that could be loaded onto a dray or a railway truck and carried off to whichever town was still working. Kalgoorlie took some of it. Boulder took some of it. Other still active fields, wherever the gold was still paying, took the rest. It is not a small thing to watch a town be carried away by cartload. A building demolished for scrap is one kind of ending. A building unbolted, packed, and re-erected somewhere else. Its timber going on to serve a hotel bar or a store counter in a town that was still growing while Kanowna was not, is a different and more exact kind of subtraction. The population figures alone would have told a story of decline. The empty blocks, framed by nothing but the stumps where a veranda post had stood, told a story of removal. The town not fading in place but being taken apart and reassembled, piece by piece, somewhere the gold still justified the freight. By the 1910s, a visitor could stand on a street that had once needed 16 hotels to serve it and count the gaps between what remained the way one counts missing teeth. None of it was finished yet. The railway still ran. The last diggers had not yet gone. What was left of Kanowna would take decades more to reach its true and final emptiness. But the direction had been fixed. The method had been set. And the town's own buildings, boarding the drays for Kalgoorlie, had already answered the question of what would be left behind when the answering was done. The dismantling that began in the town's second decade does not stop. It becomes the only industry Kanowna has left, taking itself apart board by board, and carrying itself to Kalgoorlie and Boulder, 18 kilometers away, where the ground still pays. Through the 1900s, the shallow gold is worked through, worked over, and finally worked out. Through the 1910s, the deeper reefs that remain yield less each year than the year before, and the men who once walked to the diggings from a dozen boarding houses now walk instead to the railway platform, tickets bought for somewhere else. Through the 1920s, the pattern is no longer a trend, but a fact. Each census records fewer names than the one before it, and no census reverses the count. This is not a single collapse. It is a subtraction repeated so many times that subtraction becomes the town's only remaining function. Nothing dramatic marks any 1 year of it. There is no fire, no flood, no single notice pinned to a post office wall announcing the end. There is only the slow arithmetic of people leaving a little faster than they arrive, decade after decade, until the leaving is the only motion left in the place. A store closes because there are not enough customers to keep it open, and the closing of the store means there is one fewer reason for the next family to stay. A school loses pupils because the families with children have gone, and the loss of the school means the families still deciding whether to stay now have one fewer reason to remain. The town does not fall. It thins. By the 1930s, the thinning has reached the railway line itself, the line that had once justified the town's existence as much as the gold had, the line that had carried the ore out and the timber in and the 12,500 residents' mail and furniture and pianos to a place worth having pianos in. The Depression finds Kanowna already reduced to a fraction of itself, and in those years, the station closes. The trains that still run the Eastern Goldfields line no longer have reason to stop, where almost no one is left to board them. A stop is only a stop if someone is waiting. Where the ledger no longer justifies the halt is removed. And Kanowna, once a junction of consequence, becomes a length of track that a train passes without slowing. What is left after that is not a town so much as a rumor of one. A handful of houses, a store or two, kept open past the point where keeping it open makes any commercial sense, because the alternative is closing it and admitting what has already happened. A publican pouring drinks for men who remember when the bar was 3 deep on a Saturday and is now empty most nights of the week. These are not the people who built Kanowna. They are the people who stayed after everyone who built it had already gone, custodians of a diminishing inventory of reasons to remain. The last of them do not leave in a single year either. They leave in the ordinary way that people leave anywhere, for work, for family, for age, for the accumulating inconvenience of living somewhere the shop has closed and the school has closed and the neighbors have already gone. By 1953, the last of that ordinary leaving has run its course, and the town that once held 12,500 people holds, in any functional sense, no one, not a massacre, not a fire, not an edict, a place emptied so gradually, over 5 full decades, that there is finally almost no one left, even to notice the emptying, let alone to mourn it. Kanowna is not destroyed in 1953. It is simply, by then, no longer being lived in. The difference matters. A destroyed town leaves ruins that announce what happened to them. An abandoned town leaves nothing that insists on being read at all. Only buildings quietly reverting to their materials, timber to timber yards, iron to scrap, until even the reverting has nothing left to work on. Stand on the platform today and count what the 20th century left standing. There is the platform itself, a strip of cleared ground where the Eastern Goldfields line once stopped and where no train stops now. There are 2 cemeteries, set apart in the red earth beyond the town's old grid. There are the mine workings, scarred into the ground long after the men who scarred them are gone. That is the inventory. Not a street, not a hotel, not one of the public buildings that once made Kanowna a genuine rival to Kalgoorlie for standing in the Eastern Goldfields. A platform, 2 cemeteries, and the workings. Nothing else has been left standing to argue otherwise. The arithmetic that follows is simple enough to state without elaboration. In 1899, the town held more than 12,500 people. By the census of 2016, it held about 10. By the census of 2021, it held about 12. Not a decline of some to fewer. A decline of 12,500 to 10, and then barely to 12. the kind of number that does not need adjectives put in front of it to be understood. The two cemeteries hold more names than the living town holds people, and have held more for a very long time. This is not a figure of speech. It is a plain fact of population, the kind of fact a town rarely has occasion to state about itself, because most towns are not required to. Kanowna is required to, because Kanowna is one of the towns where the dead now decisively outnumber the living, where the ledger of who is buried in the ground exceeds the ledger of who still walks on top of it, and where that has been true for longer than most of the people who might once have disputed it were alive to do so. Between the two cemeteries and the platform, the scrub has done what scrub does when it is no longer prevented from doing it. Streets that were surveyed and pegged and walked by thousands are mulga now, and spinifex and the low red dust of the eastern goldfields reclaiming a grid that was never, geologically speaking, anything more than a temporary imposition on it. The grid is still there in the sense that a surveyor with old plans could still walk it out. It is not there in any sense that a visitor without those plans would recognize. There is no facade to photograph, no sandstone front with a name still legible above the door, no skeleton of a grand hotel roofless against the sky, the way a mining town's ruin is sometimes pictured. Kanowna offers none of that. It offers almost nothing at all, which is a rarer and more complete kind of disappearance than ruin. A ruin is a town still insisting on being looked at. Kanowna does not insist. The insisting stopped somewhere in the decades between the station closing and the last house coming down, and what took its place was silence of a specific and total kind. Not the silence of a place that suffered something, but the silence of a place that was, with complete thoroughness, unmade. None of this is delivered here as a lesson. There is no rule to extract from a gold town that rose in 6 years and needed 60 more to finish disappearing. No moral in 12,500 becoming 12. No closing thought to carry out of the eastern goldfields and apply elsewhere. There is only the platform and the two cemeteries and the scrub between them. Stand there long enough and the wind is the only thing moving. The rails, where they still run past, do not slow. The names in the two cemeteries do not accumulate any further, and the 12 who remain do not require a platform sized for 12,500. The line still goes to Kalgoorlie and Boulder the way it always did, the way it was always going to, and the empty platform at Kanowna is the place the line no longer needs to stop to prove it.